The following podcast episode includes discussion on rape, incest, sexual assault, and genocide. If you or anyone you know needs help, please feel free to reach out, and we will try to connect you with the best organization to follow up with.
Welcome to the Religious Treehouse. I'm Matthew.
And I'm Jody.
I am excited for our conversation today. It should be interesting to say the least, but how are you doing?
Exciting is an okay word for it. I don't always love these kind of topics, but I think they're so important to talk about, especially to get different and new perspectives on the Bible. But I'm feeling really good about today's episode. How have you been?
I've been good as well, and I feel very similarly to you about what we're talking about today. And what we're talking about today is the story of Tamar in chapter 13 of 2nd Samuel. So getting into that, we should start with a few warnings. This is going to have explicit descriptions of incest and sexual assault. So just a heads up, content warning, this is going to be a very rough episode, as will every episode in our Texts of Terror series. We're on week 2, technically week 3 because we have in between weeks of movie reviews, but we're on our second installment of Texts of Terror going through Phyllis Trible's book.
Yeah, and so if any of this would be triggering for you or just not something you really want to hear, please go listen to one of our movie reviews or any other episodes. But please stay if you can and contribute to the conversation once we're done.
Perfect. So yeah, this is a rough story. It's fairly short, not one that I've ever heard someone preach on or anything like that. Certainly no verses in here that are going to be stitched onto a pillow for people to enjoy.
That would be wild.
Yeah.
This is my Tamar cross stitch. I think I would leave. I would exit that house. I would be like, and I'm turning around.
Yeah. No, it's rough. Very rough, but here we are. Jody, do you want to give us a very brief summary of what happens?
Yes, I'm going to try to be as delicate as possible with this. There was a very pretty girl who had 2 brothers, one normal, one sick in the head. And the sick in the head brother said, "Hey, I want you for myself." And they had a cousin who was also sick in the head who said, "Here's how you can get her for yourself." And so then he did very bad things to her and then tossed her out like trash after he did the very bad things to her. And she went to the other brother who was nice. And he was like, "Ooh, that's wrong. I'm going to kill him." And so he killed him. And then he named a daughter after her.
Yeah. No, I always love how you pick out some very small details and like this is the important thing, and then we skip over other things, which is great. But I'm excited to talk about this. And as we mentioned last time, we are looking at this from a literary feminist perspective, as is Phyllis Trible going through her book. So unlike my usual leanings to look at this from a more historical critical perspective, we are trying to focus this on the literary aspect of the text. Shall we begin?
Yes, we shall.
Cool. Do we have any thoughts before we get into this?
Poor Tamar.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
it. That's all I gotta say. Every time I learn the name of the woman that's the head of this chapter, like whichever chapter we're gonna read, I'm like, and I'm going to feel sad for her
Yeah.
by the end. So were these 3 siblings all from the same woman? They're David's kids.
David's kids, Tamar and Absalom, have the same mother, but Amnon has a different mother than Tamar and Absalom.
Okay.
So
what's the setting for this? What's been happening with David?
sure. Okay, so we're this is kind of a court story that we get in the time of David. So if we remember our conversations about the biblical history, uh, we're in the first kingdom here. So Saul has been king, he did the kingship thing, and now we have David as king. And we're in the midst of the David story where David is doing all of his things. He's the king right now. So just before this, we get David and Bathsheba, and Solomon is born. But we kind of take a step back from that and look at this story, which kind of can stand on its own, but it works as kind of an introduction to Absalom because Absalom plays a big part in the upcoming chapters. kind of creating a rebellion of sorts. There's a lot happening, and we'll talk about all this at some other episode in greater detail. But this is kind of a court scene happening within the First Kingdom. So this is before Solomon, before the first temple is built, but during the reign of King David. So that's a general outline without getting too into the details. Does that make sense? Kind of?
That makes all the sense in the world.
Cool.
I would like to have the setting established.
Perfect. So,
3 siblings.
3 siblings. So first, let's talk about kind of the structure of this. One thing I realized when reading this was that I really appreciate how easy it is, not easy, but how much easier it is to talk about literary criticism in a book than verbally. Because as I was reading things, I was like, how in the world am I going to like explain this with words out loud? Because you have to like, what's that meme with Charlie Day with like a bunch of like red yarn, like connecting all of the dots? Like that's kind of what it feels like with literary criticism. Like you're trying to like connect all of the parallels and the related texts and stuff, and it's really hard to just talk about it. But it's a lot easier to like point arrows and show connections there. So I highly recommend reading this chapter. We're going to do our best in talking about it. But this follows kind of a chiasmic structure. We talked about that in one of our Psalms episodes, meaning that this follows A, B, C, D, B, C, A structure. It's a little bit altered than what a traditional chiasm might look like, where we would expect A, B, C, D, C, B, A. The C prime and the B prime are kind of swapped, because that's just how it works. And we also get some internal structures that kind of resembles that, messy structure as well. But it works in this form where the D, the pinnacle of the conversation happens at the rape of Tamar. So we kind of expect that to be the pinnacle of what's happening in the story, and that's how we see it in the structure as well.
I was just glad I knew what a chiasmus was while reading this. Otherwise, I would have been completely lost.
Yeah.
I did a little, but it helped to have that base knowledge. And it helped when reading to kind of like see it happen, like to read this chapter first and then read the story. But yeah, this was a doozy of a story.
Right. So it starts off in part A, being the introduction, and this is kind of in 3 different parts that Trible lays this out. And we have the before the crime, and after the crime. So before the crime, we have part A, the introduction, where we're kind of introduced to all of the characters. We start with this transitional phrase, because this is just after David secures Bathsheba, and he beats the Ammonites. So we're kind of transitioning into this new conversation here. And we get the children introduced. And first we get Absalom, who is the 3rd son. And he kind of isn't mentioned until halfway through the second half of the story. And then we get Tamar mentioned, who's seen as beautiful. And then after that, we get Amnon mentioned, who's the firstborn son. And we see kind of Tamar sandwiched between these characters. And there's this tension that's kind of rising literarily between the 2 brothers, Absalom and Amnon, pitting Tamar in the center of their fight to some extent. But we get this emphasis of his sister. Tamar is their sister. It's emphasizing this familial connection. And we're kind of introduced to the problem where Amnon is attracted to Tamar, his sister, because as we see, she is beautiful. And his problem is, but she is a virgin. And the problem with this is in the period that this was written, that included some sort of protected price, that because she was royal and a virgin, she has this extra power, extra property value as she's thought of, which is why there's such a problem for Amnon here.
Oh yeah, that's the problem. Yeah, no, she's a virgin. That's the issue here. Not that she's your sister, not that she's a human being with her own agency and would probably say no. No, she's a virgin. And that is the obstacle. I'm trying to find the moral value in this story. I tried to start finding it at the beginning and I was like, I don't think there's any.
Sure. Yeah, and I think if you go into these stories saying, okay, what moral can I get out of it? You're going to miss a whole lot in the story. Like the Bible isn't meant to prepackage a bunch of morals into a story so that you can say, oh, okay, I should go be friends with my neighbor. Like I don't think that's the point of Bible. I don't think that's the point when it was written, or should it be the point of anyone who's receiving it. I think that lessens it so much to just say, what moral can I get out of this?
Speaking from a historical point, though, I know we're not supposed to be doing that. How it is there anything historical to this? Like, do you feel
Like to this specific story. So, um, I'm not convinced of many of the details being historical. Like I can't say confidently that this did or did not happen. There's debate within the academic circles about if King David existed as a person. Uh, I argue that there was a King David. That's, and there's debate on both sides. You can take either side, but I think what we have in the texts preserves a very different view of David that actually happened. I think the text is trying to present a very pristine, very washed, very clean view of David, and is trying to say, oh, we love David. David was this great guy. And in doing that, it pushes off the blame of things that David did to other people. So we can try to find some historical accuracies about the whole David story, and we can try to piece out things that may have occurred. But I don't want to say it's largely propaganda. I don't think that's exactly the right word. It carries the wrong tendencies and feelings, but I think a lot of it can be thought of in some sense as political propaganda in one way or another. So while there are kernels of truth, without doing a lot of detail, a lot of research, I can't say off the top of my head what I think is accurate and what isn't. I would say probably not this story, probably not um, historically accurate for the main reason that we get narrative insertions of things that no one could know. Like it had to be the narrator saying, and this is what happened in the room where there were no people. So there's debate. I don't think we can see this as too historical. I think if we look at it much more literarily, as Phyllis Trible is doing, we can gain a lot more. There can be a lot more thought about than trying to make this historical.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Returning back to the literary, because I had to think about it for a second. From the beginning, they kind of stripped Tamar of her agency. Like she's not an individual. Like
Right.
she's their beautiful sister.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and it's her fault that he feels ill. Like
Yeah.
they strip her of being her own person from the get-go.
Yeah.
Wait, why?
Well, yeah, and we saw this with Hagar last time as well. Um, like there's this ancient notion that women are either less than human or not even considered persons in some extent. So this is why the feminist reading of the text is important as well, because it can highlight, okay, if we weren't looking at this from the perspective that women have agency in any sense of the way, then we can miss a lot. So if we can read this text, inserting an intentional look into understanding the 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 feminist perspective and saying, okay, why are they treating women like this? Why isn't this girl given a voice? What can that tell us about the narrator and what's going on in the story? So this is just ancient misogyny happening.
Okay, so she's worth so much value because of her physical status, but like emotionally, mentally, whatever you want to call it, she does not have value. She only has value through the physical.
Yeah, and we see this through the text as it's her job to make the bread and do the things and act as a servant in some ways. I mean, she's a royal servant. She's given status and in that sense. but as a woman, she's treated as much less than.
I also read it though as like maybe it being suggested to take advantage of some instinct she has to care for others. Like, I mean, maybe it was her job to make the bread, like, but also women do have a natural instinct to care for others and to help care for others. So for that to be taken advantage of is an extra violation in and of itself.
Yeah, I think that's part of human nature to want to take care of people. But yeah, no, there's definitely abuse of her womanhood.
And that's not right. This it makes me mad. It makes me
Yeah,
really mad. Because he's like, oh, I'm just gonna pretend I'm ill, I'm sick in bed, and as she's feeding me a cake, I'm gonna pull her by the wrist.
yeah.
Ugh.
But yeah, backing up a little bit, we see kind of circles happening. So Tamar is sandwiched between Absalom and Amnon in verse 1. In verse 2, she's sandwiched between uh, Amnon and Amnon. And this is kind of signifying danger. Let's read the first two verses just to. I don't think we can do this with every verse and talk about like the literary structure between everything, but maybe just going through verse 1 and 2 might show the a little bit of the literary structure. And I think that looking at this literarily is so forgotten in how a lot of religious institutions teach these stories that there's a lot you can learn from looking at the nitty gritty little details that are often overlooked and are is part of a lot of scholarship. So in verse 1, we get some time past. We're progressing through time, and we see this is the NRSVUE. David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar, and David's son Amnon fell in love with her. So we have David's son Absalom, and then a beautiful sister Tamar, and then David's son Amnon. So we can kind of see that structure where Tamar is sandwiched between the two.
And they don't say she's David's daughter, so they separate her from him. They don't say that Amnon is her brother, so that separates her from him. And the biggest connection is Absalom and Tamar being brother and sister.
Yeah. So definitely there's that structure happening there where just reading through it as we normally would without, I mean, even if we paid like a good deal of attention to it, looking at it from this very specific literary perspective, we can gain a lot more in figuring out how this was written. But in verse 3, we get a parallel to verse 1, where Jonadab, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. I didn't look it up. I didn't look the Hebrew up to see how it's spelled. It's a weird name. I'm going with Jonadab. And he's crafty as opposed to Tamar, who is beautiful. So we get a crafty Jonadab, beautiful Tamar. And this entrance of Jonadab allows Amnon to do the impossible of getting with his sister because of his craftiness. And overall, this is spelling danger for Tamar. Well, that's the first section. That's A, kind of introducing the characters. And then we get to B, which is Jonadab and Amnon getting advice. So this moves from a narrative discourse into a conversation. And in verse 4, we get Jonadab speaking about familial and royal status, emphasizing Amnon's need to present strongly because Amnon is a strong prince. So Amnon responds saying, Tamar, sister of Absalom, my brother, I desire. And this is marked by alliteration in the Hebrew. Well, let me pull that up so we can see the alliteration. What verse is this? 4 or 5? Verse 4. In the Hebrew. Okay, yeah, so we have Et Tamar, Ahot, Absalom, Ahi, Ani, Ahov. So we get this repeated verse of Aleph starting the sentence. We have this alliteration happening. And each Aleph doesn't really translate into English. It's a glottal stop. So like if you were to say a word that starts with like an A, for example, like apple, You can kind of hear before the A noise. And so that might be kind of signifying a sighing of some sort. There's like, Tamar, sister of Absalom, I desire. And that we can kind of get from the alliteration happening there. But the fraternal language here is indicating tension between the brothers. Because according to Amnon here, it's Absalom, not virginity. That is the barrier between his object of desire.
Oh, well, I mean, I think he's just coming up with excuses.
Yeah.
This is my barrier. This is my barrier. No, your barrier is that you shouldn't do this.
Right, definitely.
Pop off. Just coming up with different things that are in his way.
Yeah. So Jonadab proposes to Amnon to fake being sick. And when David checks on him, he says, hey, get him to bring your sister, not Absalom's sister, his sister. We see him notified that this is being Amnon's sister, Tamar, to care for him. And we see this in verse 2 that Amnon was ill because of his sister. So we get that call back there, which I think is an intentional literary structure. So the plan has been set, and now it's time for action to occur in part C. So again, in the chiasmatic structure, A, B, C, D, B, C, A, we're almost to the climax in part C. So the story moves more to action now as opposed to the conversation that was happening. Amnon fakes being sick, and he says, Tamar, come take care of me. And again, there's no familial language really being used between the father and the daughter. It's always David or his brother when David is talking, as opposed to father or daughter. He sends Tamar to Amnon, and that like seals her fate. Like she's stuck. Like we've been sensing danger throughout, and now because David sends Tamar to Amnon, she's in danger. This is bad. I think it's interesting that here we have two sets of 3 verbs, each surrounding Amnon's eyes, which, if we look back at our Hagar narrative, there's a lot about looking and seeing there as well.
Yeah.
But it seems that Amnon wants more than just seeing. He wants more than just looking. And we get that through this intentional look at what his eyes are doing. So we move on from there. And then we can get to the crime. How are we feeling? That was what I would call part 1, before the crime.
Yeah.
How are we feeling so far?
Good.
What are our thoughts?
I was trying to find the words around the eyes thing. What verse is that?
It should be verses 8 and 9.
8 and 9. Okay.
Right. So it reads pretty.
She took dough, kneaded it, made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes.
Yeah. Trible's translation. She took the dough, she kneaded it, and she made bread. Having those 3 sets of verbs: take the dough, kneading it, making it before his eyes, and then she baked the bread. She took the pan, she served before him. So there's the sense of voyeurism happening that he wants to look at Tamar, who's very beautiful.
Yeah, and then when we get to the crime, can we get to the crime?
Sure.
I just noticed that in verse 11 in the NRSVUE, but when she brought them near him to eat, he took hold of her, which like the took, like he didn't grab her, he took hold of her.
Yeah.
Just like he does next. He takes and takes from her.
There's a lot of callbacks in between, like the actions that she does there with the bread and the actions that happen to her throughout this next scene. So there's a lot that's interplaying between those 2 events.
Wow. And then she asks him, no, don't do that, for that is not done in Israel. Do not do some things. Do not do anything so vile. So was she saying just don't do it because it's just not done here, or just don't do it at all?
Yeah, we're getting a little ahead, but what's happening here is, as opposed to appealing to like biblical law, the Torah, saying like, hey, like this is opposed by God. Like we shouldn't be doing this. She's appealing to like this isn't what we as Israelites do. This isn't what our people do. Which is interesting. You'd think that she would appeal to, Deuteronomy, saying like, "Hey, Deuteronomy says yada yada yada, don't do this." I mean, historically speaking, if we want to look at this as when this would be historically, um, this would have happened before the Deuteronomy was written, and before most of the Torah was written. So historically, that's could be a reason why this isn't happening. Literarily, in the story, that they already have the Torah, because that's how the story works. But as this is written, this is also written after the Torah was written, but it takes place before. It's confusing. What she's doing is appealing to Israelite customs, not appealing to religious customs per se.
Sorry, and I don't want to skip ahead because the only thing in between that and the took part was "Come lie with me, my sister,"
Right.
which we all know what that is.
Right. Well, yeah, but there's some like this section here, verses 9 through 18, like this whole section, I think is also tightly structured within like a mini chiasm of itself that parallels the greater structure of the story. So let's talk about that before we talk about like the particular details, because like the greater story, we have the A B C D B C A structure. Here we have A B C D, and then C B is kind of combined, and then A.
Okay.
So just like the larger structure, the part after the climax is kind of muddled together. Um, there seems to be something intentional happening there, probably. But we get Amnon commanding his servants to leave, and we get their response in section A. Section B, we get Amnon commanding Tamar and her response. Section C, we have a conversation between Amnon and Tamar. Section D, we have the rape. C prime and B prime, we have conversations and commands between Amnon and Tamar, which correlates well to B and C. And then finally in A prime, we get Amnon's command to the servant and their response, just like in A.
Yeah.
So first off, we get Amnon banishing the viewers. He says, "Get out of there," except for the narrator, who cannot be banished. As I mentioned earlier, we get a narration here. There's no one to tell the narration, which means there's most certainly, if this was a historical event, as you mentioned, this is most certainly, this aspect at least must be fabricated because there's no one there to tell this part of the story. Then we move on to section B, where he's alone with Tamar and Amnon addresses her for the first time. He doesn't use her name, but he invites her to bring food to the bedroom, which it reinforces the planned intimacy. She remains silent, serving Amnon, which parallels her earlier verses as well. Section C, we see that Amnon grabs her forcefully, commands her to lie with him. As you mentioned, we're all caught up on the same point now. Tamar doesn't panic. She kind of finds her voice, and she kind of has some deliberations that are slowing the plot. She isn't able to divert it and stop what's about to happen, but she's able to slow it down. She's using negatives, she's using no's and nots, and appeals to the customs of her people, to Israel, not to divine laws or even her inner feelings like, "Hey, I really don't want to do this." She doesn't appeal to that. She says, "You'd be kind of foolish if you did this. Like, this is what a fool would do." Again, she evokes the king. She's like trying to stop this. She's like, "Hey, what if we like think about David?" And she's like, "Oh no, David's gonna take Amnon's side." But she's like, "What if we did this the right way? What if we did this properly?" And Tamar is never named throughout this, which is notable because every time anyone else interjects, anytime anyone else comments, anytime any man comments, it's always Amnon said, Jonadab said. But here we just get she said or she does something, and this is really hinting at her powerlessness, and especially since Amnon refuses to listen to her.
And she's showing such calm, collected strength.
Yeah.
During this, like it's such a violating, threatening she is being faced with, and she shows strength,
Mm-hmm.
yet still not named.
Yeah. No, she's presented as very level-headed for the terror that's about to occur to her. So in section D here, this is the pinnacle of this inner chiasmus, and it's the pinnacle of the larger chiasmic structure, uh, where we get this third person narration of her rape. After the violence, the narrator interprets the act. He says that Amnon's lust turned to hatred, and this also kind of works in a little chiastic structure. I really loved her translation of this. Um, then hated her Amnon, a hatred great indeed. Truly, greater the hatred which he hated her than the desire which he desired her. We get a little structure there. Then hated her Amnon, a hatred great, and then we kind of get that reverse. Greater the hatred which he hated her.
Yeah.
As horrible as this story is, you have to appreciate the literary aspects of it. Like it's very tightly knit and very clearly intentional. Uh, and I think that's something that can get looked over because of the horror of the text. And throughout the entire Bible, like it does this. It's so well written, and so many aspects of it. But um, this is definitely a literary creation happening here with very tight literary aspects happening.
So then we get the reverse.
Right, right. Um, so previously, we're moving backwards now, and then section C prime and B prime. Previously, he beckoned her with, "Come, lie with me, my sister," and we get two imperatives now saying, "Get up, go."
Yeah.
And Tamar responds, referring to him as a brother, or she stops referring to him as her brother. The kinship has ceased, and here I think we get a really interesting insight from Trible. She says, if the narrator understands that hatred is greater than desire, Tamar realizes that expulsion is greater than the rape. Because in biblical law, if take a woman's virginity, you're supposed to marry her. That's how the marriage structure works there. So for him to rape Tamar and then send her away, he's sending her away as desolate, unable to marry again. He treats her as if she is trash. We see this in the next part, A prime, when he orders the servant to bolt the door after Tamar. He uses language such as this instead of her, and she's essentially trash thrown out, desolate, unable to have any, life of her own now because she's, broken goods in this time period, which is awful, very clearly awful.
It's what happens to her is so tragic, and the way I just
Yeah.
And then she puts, am I skipping ahead to the ashes part? Is there something?
To the ashes. What verses are the ashes?
19.
Yeah. Here we get, before we get the ashes, we have her in her ornate robe, which we talked about in our Joseph episode. Yeah. This is the only other time where the multicolored dream coat is mentioned in the Bible, and it's here in this verse here, which, as we mentioned, bad translation. I know I didn't signify how bad this story was when we talk about it in the Joseph story, but this is some ornate robe of some sense that we don't really entirely know what it means, but it seems to imply that it's something that a virgin would wear. So by her wearing this, it no longer fits her status, and she's this victim of shame that even her clothes can no longer hide. Real tragic, awful, but this is the end of the second section, and we're kind of moving backwards now. We had the pinnacle, and now we can kind of go through B prime, C prime, then A prime.
Why did she put ashes on her head? Did you show that she was marked and dirty now? Was that
no? That's an ancient sign of grief. So we talked about this on our Jonah episode when the king and even the animals repented. They tore their clothes, they put on sackcloth, and they put ashes on them. This is an ancient symbol of grief and mourning. Or repentance. It can mean any of those things, depending on the situation. But she puts ashes on her to be like, we're mourning because she's very, very sad, obviously.
Okay. And then she went away crying aloud as she wept.
Mm.
And she bumps into Absalom, who has like, I guess he guesses what happened.
Yeah, we don't get the full story, apparently. He finds out, she tells him, word gets around, something happens. And we get this meeting between Tamar and Absalom, which is similar, paralleling the conversation between Jonadab and Absalom in the B section leading up to this. So, 5 times this is the aspect of literary criticism, which is why it's not my area, because I would never find this thing. Like, this is a part of literary criticism that I would struggle so hard to like produce, but to like read Phyllis Trible's work, and I can really appreciate it. But we have the verb halak that happens 5 times throughout her narrative, and halak is one of the most common words in Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible. It appears again and again and again, and it just means to go or something along those lines, depending on how it's used. But what Phyllis Trible and literary critics do so well is finding when these words appear more frequently than they should. Like in the story of Hagar, when to see appeared far more frequently than it should, even though that's also a very, very common word. We see here halak appearing more common than it should regarding where she's going. So much of the story is how she moves from one place to the other. And she goes and she goes and she goes and she goes. And in the last time that it's mentioned, her halakking, her going, it's repeated twice. And then it emphasized by the end with her crying out in pain and upset. So in her going, it finally ends with her crying out in despair, which sad. So Absalom speaks, finally emerging in the dialogue in this whole conversation. He finally shows up, and on the surface, it kind of appears that like he's silencing Tamar and excusing the crime,
Yeah.
but as we see as we read on, as the structure appears, it implies otherwise, and he becomes Tamar's advocate. And she lays out 3 reasons for this. He's first of all, he's like the advisor, much like Jonadab is to Amnon. He says, "Be quiet, do not take this to heart," which may at first seem like he's trying to silence her, but it really kind of seems like, calm down, it'll be okay, we'll get our revenge. And rather than minimizing the crime, when we hear things with you or this deed, it seems like he's kind of using euphemisms to underscore its horror. Secondly, he's opposing Amnon here. The fraternal language that as tension is very clearly evident. Where Amnon seduced Tamar, Absalom is clearly supporting and protecting her. And then finally, we get this counter with David, where by using David to overcome Absalom, Jonadab and Amnon weakened the king's authority. But now Absalom speaks to David, or speaks to Tamar on his own power, without an appeal to David. So we're kind of trying to do a reversal of Jonadab and Amnon in this section here. But sadly, it ends with the ruin of Tamar living in death and desolation, just like the start of the section. We see her moving from the first house where she was a beautiful virgin, and then to Amnon's house where she gets violated, into this final house of Amnon where she is this desolate sister. So we see this movement happening as she gets raped and abused. Very sad, very messed up.
And it's just she was done so dirty. She was like, there's no unringing that bell. There's no undoing that. There's no removing this mark from her.
Yeah.
And all just because of the pure greed, which I don't feel was focused on enough. Like, I don't feel like this story went in enough on how truly sick Amnon was.
Yeah.
For his, and like more focused on like how beautiful she was and how like he felt nothing but this desire for her so much it made him ill, and poor him. And the yeah.
Yeah. Correct. Correct. Um, but yeah, the final parts of this kind of moves quickly. The C prime section is verse 21, um, where unlike Jonadab and Amnon, Absalom and Tamar fail to kind of have this appeal to David, but still the story goes to David, and we get this kind of contrast between David and Absalom happening there. But the king says he's very angry, which, first look at that, cool, very angry. Obviously, that makes sense, but it's not exactly clear why he's angry. Like, is David angry at Amnon for what he did, or is he angry about what happened to Amnon happening here? And that's problematic. And we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls we have kind of an explanation for why he was angry. The Dead Sea Scroll, one of the scrolls, says that he was very angry because he loved his firstborn son. Which, bummer. He's not mad at him for raping Tamar, as he should be. And then we get the Greek Septuagint, which completely gets rid of the ambiguity, and it signifies sympathy for Amnon and complete disregard for Tamar, which makes sense given that the story never once refers to them as father and daughter, even though that's clearly what they are. So we end in A prime in the conclusion, verse 32. David kind of disappears. The three central characters remain. Absalom says we're no longer speaking with Amnon, and this kind of foreboding silence kind of becomes a greater obstacle for Amnon. Yeah. Tamar's position kind of changes. She's no longer surrounded by the two brothers, as we saw in the first verse, but she's outside that relationship. She gets no adjective of beauty to modify herself, but we get this verb of violence happening upon her as her descriptor. She has become the raped sister and is the reason for the silence and the hatred, and it acts as like this end stress for the story, which is a real bummer. And that's the end of this section of the rape of Tamar.
And the biggest bummer of it all is that this story kind of reflects parts of our society.
Sure. Yeah.
Like, I reading this, I'm like, this could happen today in modern day.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that probably does happen. This is really some woman's experience reflected through a biblical story. And
yeah. And I think to go back to our earlier conversation, I think this is one of the more fruitful ways to read the biblical narratives. It's one of the more fruitful ways to read any text, any ancient text. Not to say what moral can I get out of it, but how can I read myself into this? How can the text read me? How can I read text? How can this parallel modern society? How can this tell us more about ourselves? And it's not creating a moral per se, but in its narrative, it's able to kind of reveal humanity in all of its terribleness. And I think that it can be a more helpful, maybe not the exclusive way to read the biblical text, but it can be a more helpful way to read a lot of the biblical texts.
I think it would benefit more people to actually read and preach and address stories like this, and look at it differently, which I know what you've been saying. But it really, because why did it take at least me this long? Like, yes, I could have read the Bible independently at any point, but if you're in church and you're being kind of directed on what to read, this like, I feel like everything should be given like a chance to like
right. And it's not just, I think this is another talking point in a lot of Christianity. Just read your Bible. You read the Bible, you'll figure out the points that matter. And I think even if you were to read your Bible and you come across this verse, it's 22 verses long. It's less than a chapter. If you read this, you're going to skim by it. You're not going to say, okay, this is a big thing that we should focus on. It's not that reading the Bible will like illuminate your mind. You're like, oh, okay, I understand it. I'll figure it all out. It's that in your religious context. Like you're programmed to remember what's important. Like you're programmed to say, okay, these are the important parts. These are the things that we can kind of skip by. There's a reason you've never read Obadiah, because no one ever talks about Obadiah. And there's a reason that you're very familiar with Genesis 1 and 2, because everyone talks about Genesis 1 and 2. So I think just saying, oh, I should have read the Bible more and I would have been more aware of these things, I don't think is necessarily true. I think if you read the Bible more, you'll stumble across it maybe, but you're not necessarily going to be aware of these horrible passages, even still. That's my rant.
Fantastic. So it's not totally my fault.
No.
Part of me still wants, I know I shouldn't, I want some kind of moral, some kind of reason why this was written, why
Yeah.
this woman was stripped of her familial ties, of her agency, of what made her her,
Yeah.
and like why she wasn't given more of
Mhm.
personality, like why she was just a tool for Absalom to kill Amnon, why
Yeah.
her story was told this way, because
Yeah.
it feels meaningless otherwise.
Yeah. And I think part of the feminist perspective that Trible uh, allows us to read this is by illuminating these stories, we're able to mourn with them. That this is creating a text for people to mourn, and in that it can create value in itself. Because like Tamar should be mourned. Like this is a very tragic event, a very very tragic story that should be taken seriously and mourned as an authoritative text that means something to so many people. Like we should be able to sit with this and say, "Ooh, that was very very sad." Oh, and like we kind of see this, like Absalom kind of does this because after this happened, Absalom waits 2 years and then orders Amnon to be killed. Um, our good friend Jonadab snitches on him, and Absalom flees for 3 years. And during that time, David mourns. It's unclear if it's for Absalom or for Amnon. We know for sure it wasn't for Tamar. But after 3 years, Absalom returns. Uh, David refuses to see him. There's a whole lot more happening with Absalom, story that we'll talk about at some point. But Absalom has 4 children, it turns out, and we're told he has 3 sons and he has one daughter named Tamar. And I think this is really notable because the sons aren't mentioned by name. We don't get the sons' names, but we get the daughter's name, and her name is Tamar, named after his sister that his other brother raped. It kind of acting as this living memorial. And in Absalom is described as very beautiful, and his children are very beautiful. So this beauty has passed on, living in a way that rape and desolation cannot continue. So it's the beauty that has the final word, not the rape. And I think if we look at it from that perspective, we can still mourn with Tamar, but this can also be seen as a kind of beautiful, ending to the story where it doesn't all end with death and destruction. There can be a little bit of hope, even though there's been a whole lot of really, really bad things.
But even that's not for Tamar herself, then it's moved
Right.
through her brother, through a man.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So no, it's by no means a perfect ending. But if we do want to create some moral to the story, I think one of Trible, my favorite line from Trible here, she kind of ends it with, "If we cannot sanction the violent revenge Absalom exacted, we can appropriate the compassion he shows for his sister." If we want to take a moral from this, I think it should be that one. That, hey, this is really messed up. This shouldn't happen. We should find a way to stop it. But if we can't, we should have compassion, and the most compassion we can.
I like that. I like that. Although I'm
Um,
very much team revenge sometimes. I know I shouldn't be.
yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe both is the option, but I don't preach. I don't know. Do what's best for you.
Oh, compasses.
I advocate for compassion. Yeah.
We're just here to tell you to treat people a little nicer.
Yeah. I think I can stand behind that. It is the official position of the religious treehouse that we should treat people nicer.
Yeah.
But by reducing this story to that, it misses a whole lot, and we shouldn't be reducing this to a single moral takeaway.
reducing the story to that. I was just saying we think people should treat. I don't know. We've lost the plot, but it's been an illuminating conversation.
Yeah. It's been something, that's for sure. Oh, but yeah, I think next time in 2 weeks for you all, we will be talking about um, the woman in the end of Judges who is dismembered.
Oh.
So it's going to be another rough one. But as we said last time, highly recommend you finding this book and reading along with us. There's a whole lot more that Phyllis Trible can say that we can't because she's in a book, and books are a lot easier at talking about literary criticism.
Yep.
But I'm very glad that we're having this conversation because it can illuminate a whole different aspect of what she's talking about as well. So yeah, any last thoughts?
Nope. I'm going to go cry about this now.
Cool. I
For a little.
approve that. While you cry about that, anyone listening here, while you're crying as well, I'm sure all of our listeners are crying as well. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and Bluesky and Facebook and wherever else you get your social media. And if you want to listen to our podcast, get it on Spotify and Apple and YouTube. We're on video form on YouTube. If you don't listen to us on YouTube, you can watch us on YouTube. And please send us your comments and thoughts and disagreements and agreements and questions. We would love your questions on any of those social medias, or email us at thereligioustreehouse@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening. This was an illuminating conversation. Bye, all.